At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an everyday luxury home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. In this series, we explore how designed spaces impact our lived experience and day-to-day life. Our aim is to help you understand what makes a space fulfilling and provide a scientific framework along with expert insights to help you create spaces that enhance your well-being. We delve into the entire spectrum of designed spaces, from our brain's relationship with aesthetics to finding the right designers, lighting systems, and objects that support your well-being. Ultimately, we examine how the spaces we inhabit can enrich our ability to be present and connect with others. Join us.
This is part 2 of our 2-part episode with Professor Chatterjee. If you haven't listened to part 1, we definitely recommend you go and do so before listening to this episode. Enjoy.
And most people, I think, are afraid of color. It's funny because I'm building a house right now, and we're actually picking out paint colors, and I like color, and I feel good in color. And
well, you can see behind me the color of my wall.
Yes, and that's one of the colors that I'm actually having. And so I have, all these paint splotches up on the wall, and everybody says nobody does color. And I think people are afraid because they don't know how they're going to feel when the entire room is painted that color. So they just stick with white, right? And the problem with that is then you don't get the experience of the color and what that can do for you. So I really think that this research is groundbreaking, and there are so many applications from our personal lives and our homes to treatment centers, to hospitals, to prisons. I mean, you name it, and I think that we can optimize our surroundings for the outcomes that we're hoping for.
So one thing, as you said, it reminded me, is another piece that is new, and I'm quite excited about it over the next several years, is the use of immersive virtual reality. We have scanned those refresh rooms, both of them. So now we can recreate the exact same space in people wearing Apple Vision headsets right now. Have a project that will begin where we will be using a stress induction paradigm. So we don't have people who are in recovery, but there are these experimental ways where you can try to stress people out and then have them go in as a way of getting this sort of control, more laboratory control condition. But the thing about that excites me is that if we decide that the color we used in the room wasn't optimal, and we're getting feedback from the people, right? And this goes back to your question of your own home. That's just the line of code to change the color, right? And so you can test for changes in the virtual environment in a way that means that we don't have to keep experimenting in the real world.
Yes.
Like we can optimize the next step. And so I could imagine that at some point interior designers or designers start using this, right? You can scan your room and then put on your headset and say, okay, now it's green, it's maroon, it's sunny yellow, and get a feel for what that might be like.
And even beyond a feel, what if you could have some physiological information that gives you feedback about which colors are optimal for you? I mean, that's so fascinating. I love this idea. Amazing. Yes. Sounds like a whole new company you could start.
Well, yeah. It would be nice to start a company. I mean, we haven't talked about pragmatics. The biggest pragmatic problem for us is funding because, we are not, the U.S. especially, unlike Europe, is not particularly amenable to doing this kind of work. We're very pragmatic, can-do technology that's going to solve our problems. Aesthetics is kind of frivolous pastime for the bougie and the wealthy and stuff like that. So that's a non-trivial social problem we have in terms of actually.
Where does your funding come from right now?
Well, for 25 years before I went all in on doing aesthetics, I had federal funding, NIH, National Endowment, National Science Foundation. Since then, it's been a little bit from the National Endowment for the Arts, but their budget is so minuscule compared to the NIH. But it's all foundation and philanthropy. Okay. So philanthropy becomes a big part of this.
Yeah.
And that means hustling and trying to get the word out because, people who are inclined to give money aren't going to read peer-reviewed papers, right? They're more likely to see some media. And foundations are also complicated because foundations have evolved, some of them to support the arts and some of them to support the sciences. But when you traverse both domains, they don't know what to make of you. You end up being neither fish nor fowl for many foundations. So, those are some of the real world challenges of doing this stuff.
Are researchers having more luck with funding outside of the United States in places where aesthetics are taken more seriously?
Europe, they have large European Research Council grants that several of my friends have, very substantial grants doing aesthetics work in a way that's not an option here. Interestingly, China, I think in the next few years, things are going to really take off over there. There's a deep tradition in China around what it means to be educated and cultivated. So setting aside anything that's happened in the last 50, 100 years, but there's a long, long tradition of that. And within that, the idea of a cultured person is someone who's also an aesthete. And so I think that's built in there.
Well, it's interesting. I've just been learning and reading more about acupuncture and the history, obviously, in China. And this sense of health is your whole being. So it's not just your physical manifestation, but it's also your emotional state. You can't ignore one thing for the other, whereas the Western view of things is, I recently had shoulder surgery. It was just about my shoulder, right? But it's not just about my shoulder. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense to me that they would be sort of more attuned to this aesthetic impact on our well-being fundamentally. And hopefully, I could imagine there are some philanthropists in the United States who care deeply about this. So hopefully there will be an increasing of the funding.
Yeah, I hope so. I think part of what you said earlier is true, which is there may be philanthropists who don't know this exists as a field. I mean, recently I did have an Italian gentleman give a substantial amount of money to my center, and it was... this is a bit of a fairy tale for an academic because I didn't know this guy and out of the blue. And it turned out that he wanted to give the School of Medicine, and he did give the School of Medicine at Penn a fair amount of money, but he also asked specifically about something that traversed medicine and the humanities. But he didn't know about my center. And then they said, well, they gave him a few choices, and he said that my program stood out, but he didn't know such a thing existed. Yeah. So I'm hoping there are other people like him out there.
I suspect there are. Yeah. Okay, well, goal to reach those people.
Yes.
So you've written a couple of books. One of them is called Brain, Beauty, and Art that I have read. Actually, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the books that you've written because they're different. And Brain, Beauty, and Art is interesting because you have different authors with different areas of expertise. Even just the title, I think, and you mentioned this at the outset, but I would love for you to explain a little bit about these other areas that we haven't touched on as much. Beauty is probably the one that we really haven't spent as much time on, and you've spent a lot of time thinking and working on this, and it's actually an area I'm thinking about doing an entirely other podcast series on beauty, because this whole idea of the subjectivity of what we find beautiful, how that's changed over time and how that is different culture to culture, and the very, I think, serious, both positive and negative implications of it for humans. Like, if you don't fit into what your society deems as beautiful, there are all kinds of negative outcomes. For women, for example, like if you don't wear makeup, you make less money. You know, there are very concrete things that have been studied. And then I think there are a lot of things that we intuit, but we don't know. They perhaps haven't been studied. So I think that's just such an interesting area of research. And I think that your work there could have a whole other kind of very positive impact on humanity. Just, again, like awareness is step one, and just being aware of these things is the first step in trying to sort of not let them rule us, if that makes sense.
When do you spend the most time with the people you love? For us, it's at home, around the dinner table with family, or sipping cocktails in the living room with friends. So why not make that time even more meaningful by imbuing your gatherings with pieces that not only make connecting easier, but spark conversation around your table? Amaton's collection of small batch, artisan, quality-made pieces for tabletop and home are not only made for simple serving, they're works of art designed for daily use. Whether you're hosting a dinner party or sitting down for family game night, our collections create a sense of presence and peace in every home. Shop our collection of dinnerware, drinkware, serveware, and more at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. Gather by design.
I've written as a single author 1 book and edited 3 books. So I'll talk about the books first and then come back to your question about beauty. So the first book I wrote was The Aesthetic Brain, and that's a single author book that was published in 2013 or 2014. And it was, you know, around that inflection point that I mentioned earlier in our conversation. It was a way for me to try to put what felt like, at the time, a bunch of early findings and early ideas and put them in some framework. And so that book is organized around 3 sections. The first is beauty, the second is pleasure, and the third is art. And, you know, because pleasure really ends up being central to all of these, to beauty, basically. And beauty itself, in that I talk about the beauty of people, faces of bodies. I talk about the beauty of the environment. I have sections on abstraction. So the idea that mathematics can be beautiful, what's that all about? In terms of pleasure, talking about the different forms of pleasure. What is the neural underpinnings of pleasure? How does that affect our behavior? And then art becomes complicated, because one of my big points in the book is that art is not a natural kind, in the sense that it's not one thing. And to even talk about it as one thing, we fall into a kind of conceptual trap, because art can be many things, and it just happens that we call all these things art, but it can be a vehicle for propaganda, it can be a source of inspiration, it can be something that moves us. I mean, there's so many things art does that, you know, I've been thinking about and writing a blog about this story that in the last week has been all over the place about the banana and the duct tape. And, you know, that this sells for $6.2 million, and the crypto guy eats it, that this is still art, right?
You're right.
And comparing a banana stuck on a wall to, a Rembrandt, are we talking about the same thing? And so anyway, so that's the structure of that book is kind of my take on all of that. I kind of introduce evolutionary terms, like the evolutionary way of thinking about it as well.
And even just one other thing on the art, like you have, Van Gogh, who in his time, nobody regarded his art as amazing. And then today it's highly revered. I would love to understand that as well. So yeah.
And the example I use to make the same point are the Impressionists, right? Okay. When they first came, the salons in Paris wouldn't give them the time of day. And now if you do large surveys of Americans, that's the movement or the kind of art that most Americans like the most. Right? In 150 years, our brains haven't changed. And why is this kind of perception of that changed so much? Yeah. Which kind of brings in this idea of culture and education and exposure and all of that. The Brain, Beauty, and Art book had a different intent. And if you say that neuroaesthetics as a scientific discipline has really been around for maybe 20 years, what I did was look back, and I consulted some of my colleagues to make sure I wasn't missing anything important. What were the seminal papers published in the last 20 years that we think are really important? And we ended up with around 60 or so papers, and then wrote to the first author and the senior author. And they were basically asked to respond to 3 questions. What was it that inspired them? What led up to the publication, whether it was an experimental one or a theoretical position paper? What led up to that? What were their basic claims? And then put that in a context of where they think the field is right now. Right? And so the idea was that this would give people a quick way to understand both the history of this young field and the diversity of the people working in it. So everybody in there is someone who's active in the field, right? So these are the players. This is what they've contributed, and this is what they think about the state of the field right now, right? And there are only very small points in the history of a field that you could do something like that, right? It can't be too overwhelming, right? And can't be too early. So it seemed like a sweet spot temporally to do that. Not everybody agreed, so I think we ended up with 47 or 48 chapters, but I think it gives people who are willing to look at it. And again, whenever you have multi-authored volumes, the quality of the writing is going to vary. And both Eileen, my co-editor, and I, we warned people we were going to be very activist editors. And so we really, usually when you write chapters for academic publications, you send it off and you figure you're done. But we really harass people on the wording and stuff like that. So hopefully it made it easier for lay audiences to read that those efforts were worthwhile.
Definitely.
So those are the 2 books in the context of aesthetics. The other 2 books one is on neuroethics, and this has more to do with the way in which, as our advances in neuroscience evolve, what are the ethical implications of the applications of those in the real world.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, some of the work I did a long time ago, it was 20 years ago, and continued for a while, was this whole question of cognitive enhancements. So there's a lot of work on medications for people with short-term memory problems, with attention deficit disorder, with various kinds of anxiety disorders, affective disorders. And the way in which those advances start to get used in non-clinical populations. And so, the whole issue of students who don't have ADD using Ritalin, Adderall, and, what are the ethics of that? And so there was a whole long period when I was writing a lot about that. So that's one example of the kind of thing. Yeah. And then the other book is about the roots of cognitive neuroscience, and then this is relying on my background as a cognitive neurologist. And so this is a whole book on neuropsychology of what happens to people that have focal brain damage in different domains, and what are the implications of that for our understanding, not of a disease process, but of a general system of cognition. And so that was in part an homage to my mentor who died earlier this year. And so all of the chapters of that are written by people he trained.
Okay.
So those are the 4 books.
Okay, great. And now coming back to beauty.
Yes, coming back to beauty. So beauty is fascinating. I think most people would agree with this. And especially when we are talking about beauty in people, there are all these other words that get associated with beauty. We use words like glamorous or charming or enchanting. These are all magic words, right? Beauty casts a spell on us, and there's a bit of magic in there, right, that is really hard to grasp. And we recognize this in our language, in the way we talk about it. I sometimes talk about how our brains are very good at discriminating objects. So we can tell a face from a house, from a car, from a plant, a tree. For most people, faces are especially salient, and it's an example of what psychologists sometimes call one-trial learning. It's one of the few things that for many people, you see a person just once and you remember their face. And a lot of objects that just one exposure is enough to remember it, right? But faces are that. Infants, shortly after they're born, will orient to their mother's face, or whatever face, usually their mother's in front of them, and very quickly will mimic the facial expression of the mother. You think of what extraordinary thing that is, that they are reading the expression, and from that visual information, that is being transmitted into a motor program for their own face that mimics that. Yeah. Right? That's an extraordinary thing that this little brain is capable of doing that.
Yeah.
So faces are really important. And so sometimes I talk about how our brains are very good at discriminating among objects and even within faces for many people, not everybody. But we are very sloppy when it comes to values. And so we conflate aesthetic and moral values all the time. And so there is this thing called the beauty is good stereotype, that attractive people get all sorts of unearned privileges in life, and you mentioned a few of them. People get hired more easily, get paid more. When attractive people commit infractions, they're given less punishments. Students, unless it's a standardized test, are given better grades if they're attractive, and on and on. We have looked at a corollary to that, which is that when people have facial anomalies, so this can be scars, burns, developmental abnormalities, and so on, that most people also have an implicit negative bias against those faces without knowing anything about them. That they're less intelligent, less trustworthy, less hardworking, on and on. We have found that we know something about what's going on in the brain of people who, as they're looking at these faces, it turns out the structures in the back of the brain, there's an area called the fusiform gyrus that is especially sensitive to faces. And the amygdala on the left, which is one of these emotion areas that's associated with fear and threat, but other things, the amygdala on the left and the fusiform gyrus on both sides are especially important for this kind of response. And so when people have an implicit bias against individuals with facial anomalies, the greater the implicit bias, the more neural activity you see in those regions. We know that there are, talking about individual differences, that everybody varies on a scale of something that is called the just world's belief. And what that means is that some people think everybody gets what they deserve. The world is basically just. Other people think it's all a crapshoot. It's, good things happen to bad people and vice versa and all of that. But everybody follows somewhere on that continuum. It's not that people are completely at one extreme or the other. The more people believe in a just world, the greater their amygdala activity is when they're looking at these kinds of faces. And, you can try to interpret what that means, but maybe it means they view this more as a threat and that these people deserve what they get and that sort of thing. We also find that in using kind of lab-based economic games where people distribute resources, that those particular people who have greater biases and believe in a just world are less generous to people in distributing, again, in these very controlled settings of distributing their resources to people with these faces. The story gets more interesting where we then, with some collaborators, looked at this in a hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania, a tribe called the Hadza. And the motivation for the study is that the evolutionary claim for these kinds of responses, and things that I've written about in line with this, is that we respond to this because as our brains were evolving and we were, as a species, hunter-gatherers, these were signals of health in the sense that most people died of parasitic infections. That was the major cause of mortality. Parasites typically disfigure whether it's plants or animals or people. And so if someone has an unblemished, symmetric face, this is implicitly a measure of health, right? So that's the kind of argument. If that were true or is true, we should still see this effect in a modern hunter-gatherer tribe. So we do this and we find that they don't have the same kind of stereotypic categorizations the way every other culture we've only done American culture. So they don't have that. But as they start to get exposed to non-Hadza culture, not saying Western culture, but non-Hadza culture, the stereotype starts to emerge. So we think that culture probably plays a big role in this. And then to your earlier point of just having this information exposed, we have a study that we're revising right now where we looked at movies. So 50 years of Hollywood movies, 20 years of Bollywood movies, and had a medical student very painstakingly went through IMDb. So we're not selecting the movies, the people who are heroes, the people who are villains, and starts coding whether they have facial anomalies. And, what you see is in the last 50 years, the presence of scars has gone up across the board, but the nature of the scars in villains and in heroes is very different. So in heroes, often they're small, they might be off to the side, like Harry Potter or Humphrey Bogart has a little scar up here, that sort of thing. Villains, the scars tend to be longer. They cross what plastic surgeons refer to as facial subunits. They often are kind of centrally located where we orient, especially coming under the eye. And so it's a trope that is used by Hollywood. You don't have to explain a character,
Right.
Bad guy, bad
Right.
person. And we feed this information to our kids. So the classic one that I always use is the Lion King, right? The villain doesn't even get a name. His name is Scar.
Yeah.
You're being explicit. There's nothing subtle about this. So, this is the message that we are surrounded by. And once you see it, you can't unsee it because it is everywhere. I mean, I just recently watched Dune 2. And the Harkonnen, this evil race, everybody in this has alopecia universalis, right?
Yeah.
This is like people are walking around that have no hair as a condition. And they're getting the message that they're an evil alien. And so it's all over, and you can't unsee it once you see it.
So I don't know if you've read the book Whistling Vivaldi. I can't remember the author. I'll put it in the show notes. But it's a book about race, and the author is African American and talks about walking down the street, whistling Vivaldi to connote to white people that I am not bad, I am of your culture, you don't have to fear me. And that it actually really worked. So I don't know if you have gotten to the point on what can we do to change it? And maybe that's sort of the next line of research. But I think that this whole idea of whistling Vivaldi to me tells me there are solutions, right? There are things that we can do, and there have to be more of them. I do think awareness is the first. And I was having a conversation with a pollster about bias, and I was positing that, well, we all know we have bias. And he was like, no. Most of us think we don't have bias. So we actually have to start with awareness, and we have a lot of work to do just on awareness. And so maybe that's, the next 10 years. I don't know. But are you thinking about doing any research on, are there things we can do to change the landscape?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So quickly on your whistling Vivaldi, I can tell you that as a brown and bearded guy who travels a lot, I get randomly searched a lot in airports. So I'm quite familiar with this. The whistling Vivaldi piece of that is I mean, your listeners aren't going to be able to see us. I'm not dressed in particularly formal wear, but when I'm traveling, I dress nicely. And it makes a huge difference of whether I'm stopped and searched or not. I once made the mistake. I was coming back from Paris and I was really tired and I just had sweats on, and that was a disaster. So I'm quite familiar with this as a phenomena. I think in this particular instance of facial anomalies, there are three possibilities. One is that people who have facial anomalies are just statistical outliers for many of us in our lives, right? In this country, we have a fairly segregated way of living. And earlier, I remember growing up in India, I'd see people with all kinds of physical impairments just around. It was just part of everything. But we don't have that. People get really sequestered away. So it's just there's an otherness based on familiarity, right? So that's one thing. The other is this idea of not having narratives around them, or what narratives we have tend to be negative. So we did a little study, which isn't published, where we had people come in, do some of these tests, show how much implicit negative bias they had to people with facial anomalies. And then it was a phone-based thing where they were pinged twice a day, in the morning and late in the afternoon. They open the program on their phone. They're shown a bunch of faces of people with anomalies. They're paired with pro-social vignettes of people doing nice things, whatever. And they're asked an empathy question. Because the other thing we find often is people who score low on empathy also have greater negative bias. So they're asked explicitly, do you imagine yourself in this situation, right? And so they do this twice a day, only about 10 minutes. And after a week, we have them come into the lab and we can show that their implicit bias decreases. Now, we don't know the relationship between the degree of implicit bias and how that manifests as explicit behavior. There's still a big gap there. But it's at least showing us in a small way, with a relatively painless intervention, we can start shifting the needle.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the kind of thing. I think narratives are super important. Storytelling, Hollywood, or the people who make, I'd say the art that most people consume the most right now are streaming videos. I'm guessing that, but I suspect that's true, right? If you can have more and more stories in which, we don't want to be precious about it, but just have people with these kinds of facial differences in all sorts of roles. So it just becomes normalized. I think that would make as much of a difference as anything a scientist in a laboratory could do.
No, I think that's so interesting. And so there was this concept that I think was in your book about malleability. So, and I think you're kind of talking about it now, and I'm not sure if this sense that we are actually malleable, we can change our aesthetic preferences, we can change our bias. If you have found that, or you suspect that to be true in all of these different areas, whether it's art or music, and music is obviously art as well, or like physical beauty or our physical spaces, what have you learned about malleability in your research?
So I think there's more malleability in human artifacts because there's more variability to begin with. If you give people some contextual information about art, it really changes their experience of art. If you get people to slow down and give them some tools, it changes their experience of art. I think with people, this beauty is good stereotype we find also works in both directions, which is that if you give people simple narratives of what a person is like, that it starts to change how they view them perceptually. And so people paired with the positive social vignette people start to see as more attractive, versus if they're paired with antisocial vignettes, they're seen as more negative. And I think this comports with most people's personal experiences, which is that, you meet someone for the first time, you don't know anything about them, whether you're explicit or not, you have some register of how attractive you think they are. You get to know them. If they're a jerk, that you find that they just look less attractive. And if they're nice, they start to look more attractive. I mean, I would venture many of your listeners will intuit this in their own experience, but we find that experimentally as well. So one of the ways of countering it is really, again, going back around, what's the narrative you have around people? I would argue that we all have implicit biases of one kind or another. My implicit bias might be very different than yours, but we all have them. It's the first reaction. It's the first step. It's not the last reaction. We have all of this cortical mantle and frontal lobes that allow us to not act on our immediate reflexes. And so that would be my hope, is that recognizing it is the first step, but then you can counteract it by recognizing that that's a piece of what's going on.
Well, I think there's just so much work to be done in this area. So before I like to ask every guest 5 questions, which I'd love to ask you. But before I do that, is there anything you would like to add about neuroaesthetics, your research, what you would hope people take away from this conversation, or inquiries that they undertake themselves before we move into those questions?
Yeah, if there's one thing I want people to come away with this, and I think you've done a terrific job of leading the conversation in this way, which is something I mentioned before, is that not to think of aesthetics as frivolous, as superficial, as a luxury. I think this is something that is core, is fundamental to our values. It's fundamental to living well, and it's really important, and has from a scientific vantage, we're only scratching the surface. So that's the main message I hope that gets across, because people will sometimes use even the word aesthetics as synonymous with superfluous.
Yeah.
And so if you can get people past that, I think that would be a big step.
Yeah, agreed. And that's where I think the peer-reviewed research is going to really make such a difference, because the more scientifically rigorous this is, and the broader the scientific publication, I think I think the more people will take it seriously. And also these studies like the one you're doing in this treatment center where people can see the tangible value, I think that will also really, really help. Okay, so here's my first question. As we explore in my brand, Amatand, objects can hold a lot of meaning for us. They can take us to the past, enable us to be more present in the here and now, and even take us into the future. Can you share an object, whether you still have it or not, that has a lot of meaning for you, and tell us why?
Yeah, I have one. In fact, I brought it with me here so I could show it to you, but I will describe it. So this is an ashtray. It's an ashtray that belonged to my parents. And so for as long as I can remember, I kind of saw it around. It's a paisley shape. It's metal. It's got a nice heft to it. It's got a beautiful shape. It's got all these engravings on it. And, so it goes back to as long back as I can remember. And my dad died, I'm guessing maybe about 12 or 15 years ago, and then my mother was moving to my sister's house, so we were clearing out their house, and there was a lot of junk around, as is the case of anybody's home, that what one person treasures is rarely treasured to anybody else. So, but there were a few things, and this was one of them that I kept. I had this long memory of it. I think it's a beautiful object. And so the object intrinsically has beauty to me, but it has this connection to my parents, and from when I was as little as I can remember.
So you remember it being used when you were young?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I completely believe, I think of objects, or many objects, or special ones, as vessels for memories.
Yeah.
And so it's often, the object itself may be beautiful to us, but it's what it brings to us that often is so special. I love that. Can you share a favorite tradition? It could be from when you were young, something you do today, anything at all.
Yeah, this will be part of, I guess, some of your other questions. It's always about food. I love food. Sharing food, eating food, making food, smelling food, looking at food. My mom was a fantastic cook, and she, when I went away to college, she would make these care packages for me, as many mothers do, well, especially Indian mothers, but probably this is true for many ethnicities. So she'd make these care packages, and so when I was in college, this was in the mid to late 1970s, for a lot of people, a lot of Americans, Indian food wasn't that familiar. And so, my roommates and people on my floor would want to taste it, and everybody loved it. So once she knew this, the packages would get bigger and bigger because she was now cooking for my entire floor when I'd come home. So most of the traditions I value are around food and sharing.
I love it. I love that. So this is maybe related to the next question, which is, are you in a phase in your life where you enjoy entertaining in your home? Why or why not?
Yeah, so that's why I was thinking it would be related. I entertain in a specific way now. It used to be earlier. There was certainly a phase, I'd say about 15 years, where we entertained a lot and had groups of friends. This actually goes back to when I was in med school. There were 5 of us, 5 men, young men. 4 of us loved to cook, and we had no money. So the only way you eat well is if you cook, and it's better to cook for a group. We would alternate whose house we'd go into. All of us had different styles of cooking. And so, one person would cook for the whole group. And we would do this several times a week. It turned out that eventually, when we all got married, our partners pretty consistently were never as into cooking as we were. And so we would show up in these, we'd have these reunions, and there was a kind of interesting gender swap where all the men would be in the kitchen cooking together and exchanging our techniques and what we were doing, and the women would be drinking wine in the living room, and everybody's having a grand old time. So, and after that, there are times when with different people, we'd go to different houses and cook. I think the version that has now, that this has evolved into, is really mostly with my lab, that we always have the Sunday before Thanksgiving, we have a group dinner at my house, and when someone is leaving the lab, so they've been in the lab for 2 or 3 years and they're moving on, we also have a dinner, and it's always a potluck dinner. And the idea is that everybody brings something to share with everybody else. And those have always been enjoyable. And so that's the same theme.
Yeah.
Continuing.
Food and tradition.
Food and tradition, yes. So
amazing.
And so in one tradition with my trainees, which I've done now for many years, again, this is going to sound like a broken record for people who know what a broken record is that the gift I give to people as they leave is a cookbook. And it's a cookbook that has something to do with their work and their time in the lab.
So it's a different cookbook for each?
It's a different cookbook for every person.
Lovely. I love that. We've talked about some resources, but do you have 1 or 2 top resources? They don't have to be about neuroaesthetics. It could be about anything that you care about, your own books, other books, podcasts, anything.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and this will connect with the comment you made earlier in our conversation. I decided I'm not going to talk about aesthetics books. There's plenty. You can go to my website and see stuff, and we've talked about at least 2 of the books. So, there are different podcasts that touch on this. But a book that I'd say in the last 45 years, I keep going back to at different times, is the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And it's a short book. There are 81 chapters. It's aphoristic, and it was written, I think, around 500, 600 BCE. But it is really about this way to live in harmony, way to live with awareness of your environment and nature, and to be grounded in yourself. And it's one of those books that every time I look at it, even though it's so simple, there are different pieces of it that resonate with where I am. And so that's probably the book I would recommend.
Okay. I'm excited. I have a new book to get. Last
and it's
question.
short.
And it's short, which is great. I'm reading a long book right now. So what do you do for yourself? Do you practice, a focus, a habit, or a daily routine that contributes to your success or just your well-being?
Yeah, some friends would say I'm rigid about it. So I work out almost every morning. I'm an early morning person. So I wake up at 5. I have my coffee. The gym opens at 6. So I go to the gym. So I find if I'm not working out, I get irritable and, just not so pleasant to be around. And so I think for my well-being and grounding, exercise is really important. The other thing is I spend a fair amount of time by myself. And I think that's a privilege that not many people don't have. But for me, it's really important to have swaths of time where I'm not around anyone. And so those 2 things, exercise and alone time, I think without that, I would be a disaster.
Well, those are both. I actually need both of those things myself. I'm maybe not quite as on it in terms of the time every day, but but those are both things that are important to me as well. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. It's been wonderful to hear about your work and the work to come. And I know people will learn so much. So thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure. It was fun.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people who just might need these conversations. If you have ideas for future guests or have feedback, you can reach out to us by visiting onthetablewithashley.com, linked in the show notes. On the Table with Ashley is presented by our elevated everyday home brand, Amatond, which you can find at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. You can follow